Fantasy is a game franchise that I have only a very little amount of interest in. Essentially, back in the 90s, I played Final Fantasy III on the SNES, and I played it a grand total of 1 time and kind of enjoyed it, but I never got back into the series. In 2008, I would finally play and complete Final Fantasy I, and in 2012, I would play for a little bit Final Fantasy VII, but I would never finish it. It wouldn't be until 2015 that I would finally play Final Fantasy IX. Why that game, you may ask? Well, the same person who recommended me Shadowrun Dragonfall also recommended to me Final Fantasy IX, saying it was one of the greatest games of all time for the PlayStation 1, and well, I was looking for a fantasy game at the time that wasn't something I'd played a million times, and so I finally gave it a shot, and I was not disappointed to say the least. So now, let's take a look at Final Fantasy IX's developmental history.
Each Final Fantasy game is more or less its own self-contained game, and has little to do with other games in the series. And as such, we will only be focusing on this game's development, and not the series as a whole. Development for Final Fantasy IX began before Final Fantasy VIII's development concluded, and this was to be the final Final Fantasy game for the venerable PS1. The developers wanted to create a game that was an homage to the other games in the series. The team wanted to create a story that was more understandable and digestible than the previous games in the series. The story for the game was written by Hironburu Sakaguchi, and he began work on it in 1998. The director for the game, Hiroyuki Ito, was the person who gave the protagonist for the game, Zidane Tribal, his flirtatious nature towards women. Like a regular Duke Nukem, if I do say so myself. During the conceptual stage of the game, the developers initially thought that Final Fantasy IX would be a Gaiden game, or a side story to the main series. This concept would not last long, as by 1999, Square decided to simply have it be another entry in the series. And as development continued, the ending would be changed 7 bloody times. Now, if only BioWare had done the same bloody thing for Mass Effect 3, then maybe by the 7th time, it would have been the charm rather than the other crap that we've got. Hiroyuki Ito, in addition to creating Final Fantasy Nukem, would also work on the battle system for the game as well. And eventually, the game would be released in July of 2000 in Japan and November of that same year in North America.
The Final Fantasy series is a very interesting game franchise. Why? Because for its fans, each game is the next greatest game of all time, but for the internet at large, it's just a massive font of memes to the point where one wonders how the series got popular in the first place. Well, after playing this game, one can figure out that memes are not everything. Just don't tell the internet that. So with that, let's fire up the old EPSXE emulator and take a look at Final Fantasy IX.
Like with other games in the Final Fantasy series, Final Fantasy IX is a JRPG, and like in the other Final Fantasy games, the gameplay itself is split into different elements. You of course have the navigation aspect of the game where you wander about a surprisingly large map, and when you wander about you end up tripping over random battles, and really the random battles are always the meat of any JRPG. And of course when you get into random battles you gain XP and gold, or gil as it's called here, and you can also collect cards from random battles as well.
Yes, it of course has an RPG card game. In this game, it's called the Tetramaster, and well, I tried to avoid it whenever possible. I've never liked RPG card games, and I didn't even like Pazak and KOTOR 1 and 2.
Now, in addition to the random battles, you also have story battles, which I find to be rather interesting, as many of these story battles would normally just be handled with cutscenes, and it's a lot more satisfying to actually fight these battles than just watch them take place. The battle system in general is a little different from what you would expect. It's turn-based, but it's still real-time in some respects. You have to wait your turn to attack, but if you don't attack soon enough, the enemy can get a follow-up attack on you. It's not that hard to get used to, but still weird nonetheless. Other than that real-time element, the overall combat system is more or less what you would find in other JRPGs. Like in the previous Final Fantasy games, the protagonist gets a super move, and in this game it's called a Trance, and then the attack is called a Dine, but I have to ask, why is he dressed all in pink? I mean, come on, this is supposed to be a Super Saiyan form, and he looks like he should be sweating to the oldies.
Shake, shake, shake. Shake, shake, shake.
That was weird. In any event, this trance system really just adds another attack that does more damage to the enemy. Graphics for the game are quite excellent for the year 2000. All the characters look quite good indeed and have aged amazingly. The art style is also quite excellent as well, with everything looking quite fantastical and imaginative. The locations all stand out and actually look different from one another. Whatever next? The characters also have quite intricate designs and are easy to tell apart from one another, and the whole game just feels alive. More than any other element, the music is what stands out the most. The music for the game is nothing short of groin-grabbingly transcendent. There is not one track in this game that is bad. And really, each track pretty much stands out. This is a soundtrack that is not just there in the background. Rather, it's a soundtrack that actively makes the game an altogether amazing experience. Just have a listen.
And who can forget the victory theme?
The famous Final Fantasy victory theme varies from game to game, and this victory theme is actually my second favorite of the lot. The soundtrack was created by the single most legendary composer in all of gaming, Nobuo Uematsu, and really, this is in my estimation some of his best work. He infuses every scene with musical greatness. This is not the first game that I have reviewed with a soundtrack by him either. He also did the music for Aliens on MSX, and it was also quite amazing as well.
You want to piss off a Final Fantasy fan? Or a fan of this guy's work? Well, all you gotta do is mispronounce his name. I tried my hardest to get that name's pronunciation right in the Aliens on MSX review, and yet the person who recommended me this game still complained about it. So I decided to be a little bit of an asshole and just call him That Nubo Guy. So from this point on, I shall always refer to this composer as That Nubo Guy. Start your cringing, ladies and gentlemen, because That Nubo Guy is the only way I'm going to be able to pronounce that name.
But really, That Nubo Guy can sure make some beats. And that is one of the reasons why this game is not just a fairly fun JRPG, it's actually an amazing, transcendent, other positive adjectives RPG. This game does not have any voice acting whatsoever, and is once again a bit better for it. You now have whole books worth of well-written dialogue, and you can give these characters any voice you want.
And now, let's take a look at the amazingly well-written story.
So if you've never played a modern Final Fantasy game, and have only seen videos and reviews on the others, one can get the impression that the stories for the game are, shall we say, a bit out there, with complex and somewhat inane plots and things of that nature. To where, once again, one must wonder why people like the series to begin with. Now, I cannot comment on the others, but the story for Final Fantasy IX at least shows a level of writing seldom seen in gaming, and is right up there with a well-written novel. This game's story on the surface is fairly simple. You, Zidane Nukem, must keep a princess safe from an evil queen. But that, in and of itself, is a vast oversimplification of what is really going on. The game actually has a fairly slow start to the plot itself, and really takes its time in introducing the world and the characters to you. In fact, while the game does like to use a great many FMVs, just about every important part of the game is handled by the player themselves. The game, while having a good and multi-layered plot, is also very focused on character interactions. And these are some bloody amazing characters that have a great deal of depth and emotion to them.
Really, I must emphasize just how good this writing really is. This writing actually at times brought a tear to my eye or caused me to laugh aloud.
The writing is just so bloody good. The characters are actually really funny in a way that you wouldn't actually see today. They can, of course, be serious at times, but they never do get edgy like everything has to be these days. And they can actually have fun, and they can actually react in what one would consider a human manner. I found myself seldom getting pissed off at characters for doing something completely boneheaded. And most of the time, when I thought they were going to do some sort of cliche, they surprised me by not doing it. Back to the writing for a moment, I want to show you one line that really caused me to feel a great deal of happiness and joy. Despite wanting to keep all the spoilers to an absolute minimum, I will actually explain this particular scene that we're about to see. Essentially, at the very start of the game, you, Zidane, want to kidnap the princess, but in a rather humorous twist, it turns out that
Really, that line was exceptionally cute in my estimation. It was just so well written that during that entire exchange I couldn't keep a bloody smile off my face. Really, this is a game where I almost find the combat somewhat annoying because I want to get back to the character interactions. Really, half the time, I just want to know how the story is going to progress. I don't really want to go through yet another bloody random battle. Now, let's take a look at the active time system.
Active time events cover a number of elements. You can just watch a character in another area do something, or you can control another team of characters and have them do something like solve puzzles and things of that nature. Unlike in other RPGs, you're not just stuck controlling Zidane Nukem. Rather, you find yourself controlling other characters at different times. Final Fantasy IX was also meant as an homage to previous titles, and by the great Ysmir do they do a good job of this. For one of my favorite characters in the game is Vivi, a dark mage. He is a badass, and he is also the nerd character of the game, which makes him a double badass. He has access to the dark arts, which means he can melt the faces off of enemies with his devastating fire spells. I loved the Black Mage character in Final Fantasy I, and it was and is awesome to have one as a main character in this particular game, and his story arc in general is actually pretty bloody good. Then we have Zidane himself. He is actually a pretty bloody cool protagonist and is not a whiny moron like some other Final Fantasy protagonists. When I call him Zidane Nukem, I ain't exaggerated on that one, as he does have a Duke Nukem level kind of charm to him, and you can't help but want to see him succeed. Ultimately, this game is just, in every sense of the word, brilliant. The characters are brilliant, the writing is brilliant, the graphics and gameplay and music are brilliant. This is really a true gaming experience.
And so that is Final Fantasy IX. This is one of the most legendary Final Fantasy games of all time, second only, probably at least, to Final Fantasy VII, and it's not hard to see why. Really, if you're not a fan of Final Fantasy, I would recommend giving this one a try, as it doesn't have all the elements that are so meme-worthy. Really, for me, this was what I like to call a 3 o'clock game. This was a game that I played until 3 o'clock in the bloody morning and got no sleep that night. This is a game that actually kept my interest where other games can easily lose it. This is also an example of a game that doesn't necessarily rely on nostalgia, as I never played it back in the day, and I was approaching it as a modern gamer in many respects. And it still holds up. And so, I am GeneralLotz, wishing you good Final Fantasy VII and good Final Fantasy X, or whatever makes you happy.
If you enjoyed my review of Final Fantasy IX, please consider subscribing, and if you can, please consider supporting me on Patreon so that I can continue to bring you these great reviews.